we have destroyed collectively as a society $35 trillion in global market value. Now, to give you a sense of that, that's 14% of all global wealth that has been destroyed in basically 5 months. And for reference, in 2008, when we went through, a cataclysmic shock to the system that threatened the banking infrastructure of America and a potential contagion to the world, that destroyed 19% of the world's global wealth at that point. So, we're approaching some really crazy, heady moments in time where, in terms of the market correction and the value destruction. The difference here is that the last time around, it was really about a handful of financial institutions and some very specific assets, right? Mortgage-backed securities, some parts of the credit market, and then a bunch of financial stocks. And that was largely it. This time around, as you just said, Freeberg, it's literally everything that's getting smoked. There is not a place that you can effectively hide that has been safe. Crypto, smoked. The credit markets, totally frozen. The equity markets, NASDAQ is in a bear market. The S&P is basically flirting with the bear market now. And I don't really see any end in sight. Meanwhile, we're waiting for CPI to downtick. Inflation hasn't really done that. So that's taking a lot longer than we thought to sort of roll over. Separately, jobless claims are now starting to tick up, which means that companies are beginning to affect layoffs because they feel this pressure. So now you're going to see an unemployment rate that starts to go up. And then meanwhile, we're fighting a proxy war in the Ukraine against Russia to the tune of about, $40 billion every sort of month or so when we open the paper and decide to read about it. So you put all these things together, it's not clear that there is the momentum to create a market bottom. We actually haven't started to remove the money in the system. So the process of quantitative tightening, which is the Fed's mechanism of removing liquidity, is going to start now to the tune of about $90 billion a month. But to run off all the money that they printed will still take 3 years, right? So we have to take about $3 trillion of excess capital out of the economy. And so if you add that 3 trillion as well, that's just going to disappear to the 14 trillion we've already, or the 14%, the 35 trillion, sorry. You're starting to touch numbers that are, as bad as the GFC in terms of global wealth destruction. And again,
you're referring to the great financial crisis when you say GFC, 2008.
Unlike the GFC, this wealth destruction is touching a lot of normal, everyday folks in very broad-based ways. And that wasn't necessarily the case. There were a lot of people that unfortunately lost their home, but even that was still relatively contained to the hundreds of thousands. Here we're talking about tens of millions of people owning every kind of imaginable asset class who's seen wealth destruction, somewhere between 25 to 90%.
I just want to make the case, like people keep using this term wealth destruction, and it was only wealth that was accumulated in the last few quarters since we had COVID and we released all this capital and made interest rates zero and flooded the market with money. So everyone kind of gets the money and then they're like, hey, I'm worth a lot more. And then all of a sudden the free money's taken back and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm worth less. I've been destroyed. It's crazy. The reality is this was meant to stimulate the economy. Money was released. And the idea when you release capital from a central bank is that that capital flows its way into productive assets, meaning businesses that can employ people, that can create products that people want to consume. And ultimately, it's very hard to manage that when your only mechanism is to raise or lower interest rates and make capital available or buy bonds. At the end of the day, a lot of that capital flowed into financial assets and inflated the value of those assets, the value of stocks, the value of crypto, the value of bonds that we own, the value of startups that we all own. And all of those assets, the value of the stock went up, but the capital didn't necessarily flow into creating new jobs, creating new businesses, and creating new products. And at the end of the day, if that capital didn't really go in to create value and it comes back out, and all that happened was we had this kind of inflationary moment in terms of asset prices, and we didn't actually create new jobs and didn't actually stimulate the real productive economy, that's where we have a problem with stagflation and where we are inevitably going to run into a recession. And I think the biggest concern I have...
Let's be honest, we're in a recession right now. This is the second quarter. We're in a recession.
The biggest concern I have, as I mentioned earlier, is this consumer credit problem. A lot of consumers got used to the free money over the past 2 years. And people took that money and they went and bought new cars, or they bought crypto, or they bought
NFT.
one thing or another, NFTs. And a lot of people got used to living a lifestyle that allowed them to spend in a way that they otherwise would not have been able to spend. And then all of a sudden, the rug got pulled out. And now everyone's like, well, I want to keep living this lifestyle. I want to keep spending this money. I had all this stuff taken away from me. Shoot, what am I going to do? And then they take on credit. And the credit markets haven't tightened enough yet on the consumer side that we may find ourselves in a really ugly consumer credit bubble. Here's a crazy statistic for you guys. In the 2008 financial crisis, the median home price to median income in the United States was 5x. Today, it's 7x. So people today own homes that are significantly more expensive relative to their income and earnings than was the case during the financial crisis that caused a massive housing bubble.
We're in a stock market crash that I think over the last week sort of became a panic. I mean, I think now there's panic selling going on. That's not to say that it's all oversold, but certainly there are names now that are starting to become screaming buys. But nobody has the capital to buy. I mean, it's easy to say, in theory, that you should be greedy when others are fearful and fearful when others are greedy. The problem is that everyone's already fully deployed. And then when the stock market crashes, they got no cash left to buy up new names. And, that's one of the things that you've noticed in this downturn. And I'd say, especially with crypto, is with all the other crypto downturns, there were always, this is just a rout across the board. I agree. It's every asset class. I think home prices, that's coming. Like you said, mortgages are going up.
Inventory is going up. So that's a leading indicator. Yeah.
People can't afford the same mortgage they did before because rates are going up very fast. So sellers are going to have to drop prices. And until they're willing to do that, the inventories go up. And frankly, I think the consumer in general, that's the next shoe to drop here. Because right now you had this sort of financial correction, you had this massive asset inflation, and now that the air has come out of the balloon, but the consumer has generally been holding up pretty well. Obviously, we had unemployment near 3%, very low, although the labor participation wasn't great, but the consumer was doing fine. It was sort of holding up the economy. Now I think you've got a bunch of different factors that are going to really hurt the consumer over the next several months. Like you said, interest rates going up means that home loans become more expensive, car loans, any other personal consumption loans go up. Credit card debt now has all of a sudden skyrocketed. So there's an article in Axios on this, that the amount of consumer debt is surging and to this highest level of increase in over a decade. So consumers are turning to plastic to cover the soaring cost of everything. And then because of inflation, that wages in real terms fell 2.6% over the past year. So if you were to look at wages in real terms, people are actually making less money. First, you're right. The companies that get impacted are the ones with exposure to the consumer, but then those companies start sharpening their pencils and buying less. So the question is, how much are earnings now going to be impacted in the B2B space? And what sort of recession do we have? I think recession now is just inevitable. To Chamath's point, you can't have 14% of global wealth wiped out practically overnight and not have that translate into a big recession.